The last full month of the CPL offseason has come and gone, and so it is time for us to review the major transfers that happened in March. Now, with the CPL season starting this week, there were significantly less transfers in the Canadian Premier League as there had been in the previous 2 months, as most teams wanted to have their rosters mostly buffed out prior to the start of training camp in March. Thus, in the past month, there have only been a few signings or loans of significance throughout the league, but there have been significant loans and signings nonetheless. To start things off, Luke Singh has been loaned from Toronto FC in Major League Soccer to FC Edmonton. Now, if you're confused thinking that Singh had already been loaned to the CPL, you are correct. Luke Singh, back in January when TFC signed Lucas McNaughton, was supposed to be going the other way to Pacific as a one-year loan to kind of be a McNaughton replacement as a part of that deal. But that fell through. Pacific and Luke Singh and TFC all decided that that wasn't in fact the best move for him, and he returned to Toronto FC for a little over a month before, at the beginning of March, getting reloaned to the CPL, this time to FC Edmonton. Singh, of course, burst onto the scene with Toronto FC last season as an emergency call-up going into their first round of Champions League matchups, making appearances in both of the first two matches in the first round of the CONCACAF Champions League, where TFC upset Club Leon, and made 6 appearances throughout Major League Soccer last season. Singh goes to an FC Edmonton team that is filled with loaned players, but unlike most of them, instead of being a inter-CPL loanee who is essentially just on loan because their salary is being paid by another team while the rest of the league supports FC Edmonton, Singh is actually a player sent to FC Edmonton on loan from a club in a higher league on development purposes. He will likely be the #1 defender for FC Edmonton this season, replacing the role that Amer Didic has held with the team the last 3 years. He alone will not make FC Edmonton a contender, but he should get a boatload of minutes barring an injury, and this should be very good for his development. Next up, we have probably what was the biggest international transfer of this month in the Canadian Premier League. Abdoul Sissoko, a 32-year-old French midfielder who has spent time playing in Ligue 1, in La Liga, and most recently played for Kuwait Soccer Club in the Kuwait National League, has transferred to Atletico Ottawa. Sissoko has experience of Troyes in France, Udinese in Italy, and Granada in Spain. So he has played for some pretty big name European clubs throughout his career, and now he is landed at 32 years old with Atletico Ottawa in the CPL. This is another major move in what has been a fantastic offseason for Ottawa. Ottawa right now is my winners of the offseason with the additions they have made. And with Sissoko, they get an experienced midfielder who has played football at a very high level. He should be a very nice addition to their midfield in a leadership role and act as just sort of a calming presence to just be a piece of consistency within that roster. Going into March, Pacific FC still had not replaced Taron Campbell after losing him to Forge in the offseason. And this past month, they finally got around to fixing that gaping hole up front by signing exciting Vancouver Whitecaps prospect Kamron Habibulah on loan. Habibulah is an 18-year-old striker who made 3 appearances last season at the age of 17 for the Whitecaps. He is one of the more exciting young Canadian strikers rising up through the ranks that's currently playing in Canada, and having scored 3 goals in qualifying for the 2019 U17 World Cup and playing 3 games at that U17 World Cup in 2019 for Canada, he is a guy who already has experience with the Canadian national system. Getting loaned at the age of 18 to Pacific, this is very obviously Vancouver trying to make sure he gets as many professional minutes as possible this year. And Habibulah, I think, is my young player to watch for the CPL this season. He has potential to tear up the league and really solidify himself as a true offensive scoring threat in the CPL and really push himself into a position where he is going to be a useful piece for the Whitecaps next season. After losing Nathan Ingham to Atletico in the offseason, York United was needing a goalie to play in tandem with Nico Giansopoulos, and they found that in Matthew Noguira. Noguira is a 24-year-old who is a former Toronto FC Academy player who has spent the last several years bouncing around the lower divisions of Portuguese football. Spending most of his time in the 4th division, he did make one appearance for Maritimo back in 2019 in the Portuguese League Cup when Maritimo was playing in the Portuguese Primeira Division. Overall, in the past 4 years, though, he has only made 19 competitive appearances, so his experiment in Europe seems to have not gone the way he had hoped, and now he is returning to Toronto, where he was born, to play in the CPL, and will likely play in a tandem with Nico Giansopoulos. Giansopoulos is a very good keeper and too good to be a traditional backup, so I can see those two working in a good tandem. Will Noguira be a better keeper for York than Ingham was? That remains to be seen. He has a very little sample size of professional games, obviously, from the last 4 years. So it'll be interesting to see how he performs in the CPL, and even if he's not good enough to be a #1 keeper for York, Nico Giansopoulos is probably good enough to be a #1 for York anyways, so he just adds a little interesting piece to their roster, and it will be nice to see a bit of goaltending competition between Noguira and Giansopoulos as the season rolls forward. And finally, in terms of true CPL major moves from the month of March, we have a trio of MLS Next Pro signings. First off, we have Clady Sela and Cela Karajovanovic of Forge and Halifax Wanderers respectively, both signing with Toronto FC II in MLS Next Pro. Both 22 years old. Sela was a depth defender for the Forge the past few seasons, actually didn't start the 2021 season on the Forge roster and only was signed on for August onwards. And Karajovanovic was a 2021 CPL U Sports draft pick for Halifax, who played 26 games for him last season, but only scored 1 goal in the Canadian Premier League. Two interesting players to move to MLS Next Pro, because the previous 2 players that moved to MLS Next Pro from the CPL were Mo Farsi and Kwame Awuwa, who both were very exciting top-of-the-line talents in the Canadian Premier League, and Karajovanovic and Sela are useful players in the CPL, but I wouldn't call them anything really more than young depth in the Canadian Premier League the past few seasons. However, these 2 players do continue the interesting trend and debate I've been talking about in these videos of now that MLS Next Pro exists, it adds another wrinkle into an area where these young Canadian players can go into. Do they play in the CPL or do they play in MLS Next Pro, and what gives them the best shot at moving forwards in their careers? So these 2 are actually a real good test of that, because it's 2 players who were not major players in the CPL who are now in MLS Next Pro, so we'll see how that works for them in their careers. And finally, the last MLS Next Pro transfer, which actually happened at the beginning of April, but I'm going to cheat and say it was a March transfer just because, you know, the season's about to start and I'm not going to do an April big transfers video because of that. Ryan Telfer, the former Toronto FC man who played for York 9 in their first 2 seasons in the CPL and for Atletico Ottawa last season, has signed with the Columbus Crew 2, joining Mo Farsi. Telfer is a 28-year-old who burst onto the scene with Toronto FC back in 2018 before moving in 2019 to York 9 and scored the first ever goal in Canadian Premier League history. He had a pretty solid 2019 season with York 9, being one of the league's top goal scorers, but fell off, not scoring at all in 2020 and then only scoring 3 goals in 16 appearances last season with Atletico Ottawa. Apparently there are rumors of his personality just not really fitting in with Ottawa last season, and coming into this year, it didn't really seem like anyone in the CPL was really looking to pick him up after a few disappointing years, and obviously he probably would have had one of the higher salaries in the Canadian Premier League the first 3 seasons. He moves to the Crew 2, and unlike Sela, Karajovanovic, or Farsi, who are all young guys who you could see using their MLS Next Pro plays to try and leverage a move into MLS or a different higher league. At 28 years old, Ryan Telfer isn't really the player that MLS Next Pro is made for. Yes, there are players over the age of 23 that are allowed to be in MLS Next Pro because it is a fully professional league, but they're more auxiliary pieces and kind of mentor pieces in that league. So it's interesting for Ryan Telfer, this move. It's not really a step forward in his career, though it's not really a step back either. It's kind of him staying at the same level but moving to a different country to play, in all honesty. But Telfer has always been been a bigger name in the Canadian Premier League, and him moving out of the Canadian Premier League is something that should be noted, and it also adds another wrinkle to the Canadian Premier League versus MLS Next Pro storyline. And finally, two moves that aren't really transfers per se for the CPL this season is two players who were re-loaned from MLS teams to CPL teams, both getting loaned back from their MLS teams to the same CPL team they were on last season. First off is Karifa Yao, the Montreal center back who is going back on loan to Cavalry FC in Calgary. Yao was a solid defender last season for Cavalry and will continue his development with the team this season. It's nice for them that they get to maintain that solid defender for another year. And the second is Jonathan Sirios, who was Valor's goalkeeper last season, again also on loan from Montreal. He is back to be Montreal's starting goalkeeper this season. And interesting to note, this marks the third straight season where Valor's starting goalkeeper is on loan from Montreal and MLS. 2020 it was Pantemis, 2021 it was Sirios, and obviously now 2022 it is Sirios again. So third straight year now, or 75% of the seasons in their existence, Winnipeg hasn't gone and signed their own starting goalie. They've opted to just borrow one from Montreal. And that's just a funny little quirk that I think requires mentioning. There you have it. Those are the biggest moves and moves of note from the Canadian Premier League in the month of March. The CPL season starts this week on Thursday with York taking on Halifax. I'll try to make a predictions video before that. Worst case scenario, that'll come out Friday or Saturday, right when the season's just getting started. I have a really busy week this week, sorry guys. But there you have it. Those are the biggest transfers. Let me know down below in the comments what you think of what your team did in March. And as always, if you like this video, hit like if you want to see more of my stuff. Hit subscribe. Follow my Twitter, link is down below in the description, and I will see you next time.